People talk about power like it's a thing you carry in your wallet. Like if the number has enough zeros behind it, every door opens. Every mouth closes. Every man in a uniform quietly steps aside and pretends he didn't see what he just saw. Desmond Hale believed this the way some men believe in gravity, not because he'd tested it, but because it had never once failed him. Like, he'd bought planning committees. He'd bought silence from a sitting MP allegedly. He'd once handed a folded envelope to a Swiss customs officer at 2 a.m. and boarded a flight that, by every existing regulation, should never have left the ground. He wasn't a stupid man, and that's what made it worse. He walked up to the gate at St. James's Palace on a Tuesday afternoon in October, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's cars, with the particular expression of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no and believed it. The guard didn't move. Not a flicker. Not a breath. Plus, not a blink. And Desmond Hale, worth, by Forbes' estimate, somewhere north of £4 billion, reached into his inside pocket. What happened in the next 40 seconds has been repeated in security briefings, whispered about in barack rooms, and described by at least one retired colonel as the cleanest dismantling I have ever witnessed without a single shot fired. This is that story. I have a habit that every senior officer in my chain of command has, at one point or another, described as concerning. I write things down. Not in the honestly official log that's filled with bureaucratic shorthand, timestamps, incident codes. No. I carry a small green notebook, the kind you can buy in any newsagent for 60 pence, and I write down what I actually see. The real texture of a thing. The way a man's jaw tightens before his mouth says something his jaw already knows is wrong. The exact sequence of a guard's eyes during a standoff, where they go, in what order, for how long. My commanding officer, Major Bellhost, once told me this habit would either save my career or end it, and he said it the way a man says something he already knows the answer to. I was posted to the external observation corridor that Tuesday, a narrow walkway behind reinforced glass that runs parallel to the St. James's Palace Gate approach. My official function was administrative oversight of the rotation schedule. My actual function, which Bellhost never acknowledged aloud but clearly sanctioned, was to watch. To notice things that cameras miss because cameras don't understand weight. Cameras don't know when a man is performing confidence versus carrying it. Desmond Hale arrived at 14:23. I'd been briefed on him the way you're briefed on weather, imprecise, cautionary, mostly useful for knowing what coat to bring. High-profile individual, and known for unconventional approach to institutional access. Handle with protocol. That was the entirety of the intelligence package. I'd laughed when I read it, alone in the briefing room, which echoed. He came on foot from the Pall Mall end. No entourage, which was itself a decision, I noted. A calculated stripping back. One man, one coat, one very expensive pair of shoes clicking against October pavement with the rhythm of someone who has timed his entrances. He wasn't rushed. Rushing implies the possibility of being late, and Desmond Hale had structured his entire existence around the premise that nothing begins until he arrives. The guard at the gate was Lance Corporal Thomas Reeve. I want to be precise about Reeve, because imprecision here would be a disservice. He was 24 years old. 18 months into his posting, having rotated through Windsor and the Tower before St. James's. He was, by every measurable metric, unremarkable, medium height, square jaw, the kind of face that photographs as dependable rather than striking. His look, kid, was immaculate in the specific way that suggests genuine habit rather than nervous inspection prep, the brass worked to a warmth rather than a shine, which sounds like a small thing and isn't. Reeve had a tell I'd catalogued over 3 weeks of observation. When he was at full alert beneath the ceremony, when something had triggered the professional beneath the parade ground performance, he moved his right thumb, slowly, along the seam of his glove. Not a fidget. Actually, a grounding. A man quietly taking inventory of himself. His thumb moved the moment Hale's shoes hit the approach stones. I uncapped my pen. Hale stopped at the appropriate distance. He looked at Reeve with the frank, expectant gaze of a man accustomed to being recognized, and, when recognition didn't arrive, when Reeve's eyes simply stayed where they were, level, patient, pointing somewhere slightly past Hale's left ear in the middle distance stare that's part focus and part ancient psychological warfare. Hale did something interesting. Basically, he smiled. Not the smile you give someone you're glad to see. The smile you give someone you're about to make an offer to. Generous, preemptively forgiving. The smile of a man who has already decided the next 5 minutes are a formality. I have an appointment, Hale said. His voice carried educated. Southern. The kind of vowels that get ironed in at school and stay pressed for life. Reeves said nothing. His eyes didn't move. With the Lord Chamberlain's office, Hale continued, adjusting slightly, recalibrating. There's a meeting regarding the Hale Cultural Foundation's autumn commitment. It should, I think, be logged. Reeves said nothing. I was writing. What I wrote was, he expects the silence to be an obstacle he can buy his way through. He doesn't understand that the silence is the point. Hale reached into his coat. I'll tell you what I saw from the observation corridor, plainly and, without dramatization, because the plain version is the one that stays with you. He produced an envelope. Plus, white. Thick. The kind of envelope that has weight before you open it. He held it with 2 fingers, loosely, extended slightly toward Reeve, not a thrust, not an aggressive gesture. A presentation. The gesture of a man offering something he assumes will be accepted because he's never, in 47 years of living, had an envelope like this declined. Reeves' eyes came down from the middle distance. They found the envelope. They found, to be fair, it the way a piece of precision machinery locates a foreign object, no alarm, no drama, purely mechanical recognition of an anomaly. And, TBH, then, Reeve looked back up. Past Hale's left ear. Back to the middle distance. The thumb moved again along the glove seam. That was all, and Hale stood there for a moment that I clocked at approximately 4 seconds but, which, from the way his shoulders moved, he experienced as considerably longer. The envelope stayed in his hand. He had nowhere to put it now that wasn't worse than where it already was. Pocketing it was an admission. Persisting with it was escalation, and dropping it was unthinkable. He said, I think there's been a sir. Reeves' voice came out level and quiet and absolute, the way a structural beam is quiet. You'll want to contact the Lord Chamberlain's office to confirm your appointment reference. The number is publicly available. Not, you need to leave. Not, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. Not a single molecule of threat or aggression, because neither was necessary. The sentence had one function, to return the situation to Hale, intact, with every implication clear and, none of them spoken aloud. Hale pocketed the envelope. He straightened his coat. He walked back the way he'd come, his steps still measured, still the rhythm of a man who believes he controls the timing, but something had changed in the measurement. A half beat off. Barely perceptible. Plus, I looked down at my notebook. I'd written, without noticing I was writing it, he thought the silence was waiting for him to fill it. Actually, I underlined it. Then, actually, I wrote underneath, it wasn't. He came back on Thursday, which I know, because I was eating a sandwich in the corridor observation post when his shoes appeared on the approach stones again, same coat, different tie, same clicking rhythm, and I put the sandwich down and picked up the green notebook and felt, for reasons I'm professionally embarrassed to admit, something close to delight. This time he had a woman with him. Early 40s, dark suit, the precise posture of someone whose entire professional value is the management of other people's disasters. She carried a leather portfolio and walked half a step behind Hale, which told me she was staff rather than counsel. Counsel walks level, makes eye contact, takes up space. She was a fixer. Paid to smooth things into shapes her employer preferred. I noted her immediately and noted her name from the briefing update that had arrived that morning, Charlotte Ferris, Director of External Relations, Hale Group. 19 years with the company. The kind of longevity that means either genuine loyalty or knowledge too dangerous to take elsewhere. She was, I suspected, not happy to be here. The Tuesday rotation had brought Reeve. Thursday brought Corporal Danny Osei. Osei was different from Reeve in almost every measurable way. Brought her, 2 years older, with a face that collected small expressions like a journal collects entries. he laughed more than Reeve. Not on duty, obviously, on duty he was a wall, but, in the brief corridor glimpses I'd catalogued. A half smile at something a colleague said, a raised eyebrow at a pigeon attempting to land on a tourist's head. He was a man who found the world quietly, privately, inexhaustibly amusing. I'd no idea, that Thursday, how important that quality was about to become. Ferris stepped forward before Hale could speak. This was clearly the play: remove the variable that had failed, introduce a new register entirely. Professional. Administrative. Plus, frictionless. "Good afternoon," she said. The voice of someone who has diffused things for a living. "We're here on behalf of Desmond Hale, who has a confirmed meeting with the Lord Chamberlain's office. Reference number VX-7741-C. I can show you the correspondence." She opened the portfolio. Osei looked at it. His expression didn't change. But I watched his eyes move across the paper with the unhurried attention of someone who actually reads things rather than performs the act of reading them, and I saw a flicker, barely the quality of recognition. He handed it back. "Thank you," he said, and, one moment. He produced his radio. Turned slightly. Spoke into it quietly, 3 sentences, too low for me to catch from the corridor. Waited. A response came back, also quiet, and Ferris was watching him with professional composure that had an edge to it now, a tightness around the portfolio's corners where her fingers had pressed slightly harder. She'd clearly expected the reference number to function as a key. It had not functioned as a key, and something in the confirmation procedure had not confirmed. Hale, standing behind her, had not looked at Osei once. He was looking at the palace gate. At the stonework. At the geometry of the entrance, the kind of look a man gives a thing he's decided he will own. I've seen it before in other contexts and it never fails to produce a particular cold sensation between my shoulder blades. I wrote, "He's not here for the meeting. The meeting is a vehicle, which he's here to establish that the gate opens for him." Osei turned back. "The reference," he said, with the specific courtesy of a man who has been trained to deliver bad news without flinching and has discovered that the training actually works, is listed as a provisional inquiry. Not a confirmed appointment. The Lord Chamberlain's diary doesn't reflect a scheduled visit for today. Ferris blinked once. There must be an administrative error on your end." "It's possible," Osei said, in a tone that communicated clearly that it wasn't possible. And then, Hale spoke. Until this moment, he had let Ferris run the play, which showed a calibration in T expected from Tuesday. He'd watched, reassessed, deployed a different instrument. But the instrument hadn't worked, and now I could see it. That particular moment when a man who controls things feels control sliding, he stepped forward. "Do you know who I'm?" he said. Plus, I have heard this sentence, in various forms, more times than I can count, and it always means the same thing. It TBH means, the usual rules have not applied to me and I need you to acknowledge that. It is a sentence that functions as a last resort dressed as a threat. Osei looked at him. Plus, for a moment, a long moment, the kind that has texture, he said nothing. Then, "Yes, sir." Just that. Not yes, and, therefore. Not yes, but, I'm afraid. Simply yes, unadorned, floating there between them like something Hale was going to have to pick up and examine himself. The yes contained everything and resolved nothing. It confirmed that Osei knew precisely who Hale was, had known from the moment his shoes hit the stones, and that this knowledge had not altered a single procedural step. It was the most efficient sentence I have ever observed a human being use against another human being. 2 letters. Thermonuclear, and Hale stood very still. Ferris was looking at her portfolio as if it had personally betrayed her. "We'll reschedule," she said finally, to no one in particular. As they turned, I caught something. Plus, Hale reached into his coat, the same gesture as Tuesday, the inside pocket, and stopped. Just stopped. His hand, I guess, still inside the coat, and, for 1 second he stood like a man who had reached for something familiar and found only his own ribs. He withdrew his hand empty. They walked, to be fair, back toward Pall Mall. Ferris said something to him quietly, leaning slightly in. TBH, he didn't respond. His steps had the rhythm of Tuesday, measured, controlled, but there was a quality underneath the control now that hadn't been there before. I sat with my notebook for a long time before I wrote anything. What I finally wrote was this: "Oh, say new." From actually, the first second, he just needed Hale to understand that knowing made no difference. That was the lesson, which Hale paid for a lesson he couldn't yet name. I put the cap back on my pen. Outside, the October light was going the color of old brass, and the gate stood exactly as it had stood for 140 years. Unmoved. The third time, he didn't come himself. For what it's worth, that was new. Plus, that was, I noted in the Green Book, a tell, the first genuine one he'd displayed across 3 interactions. Men who come to establishments like this in person, repeatedly, with money and documentation and rehearsed justifications, do not suddenly send proxies unless something has shifted in their assessment of the situation. He'd upgraded his threat model. He decided to be fair, that he was the variable that kept failing. This told me something uncomfortable. Desmond Hale was, in fact, a man who could learn. The proxy arrived at 9:40 on a Monday. A solicitor introduced himself as Prentice, Gareth Prentice, from a firm I won't name but recognized immediately from a Whitehall briefing about lobbying compliance from 8 months prior. He was smooth in the way that certain legal professionals are smooth. The way ceramic is smooth looks frictionless until it cracks, and then it shatters. He had a different kind of paperwork. Plus, not a meeting reference. A formal, actually legal letter, addressed to the office of the Lord Chamberlain, which, and I want to be precise about this, because it matters, he didn't attempt to hand to the guard. He read it aloud. Standing at the gate approach, on a public Monday morning with tourists cycling past on Boris bikes and a school group filing toward the mall, Gareth Prentice solicitor read a formal letter aloud in the direction of the gate, from a distance calculated to be just outside any jurisdiction that could be called obstruction, in a carrying barrister's voice trained to fill rooms considerably larger than a palace forecourt. The letter alleged procedural misconduct. It alleged that 2 prior visits by his client had been met with undue obstruction of legitimate civic engagement. It cited, with impressive specificity, sections of the Equality Act. It used the phrase formal complaint 4 times. It concluded with an invitation, the word sitting there brazen and oleaginous, for the relevant officer to provide their identification and service number for the purposes of the complaint process. It was extraordinary, which it was, in its way, brilliant. It turned the gate into a courtroom with no judge and only one witness, the public. The guard on Monday morning rotation was Reeve again. I'll tell you what Reeve did. He stood. He listened. He gave absolutely no indication that he was listening, eyes forward, chin level, breath steady, the same ceremonial stillness that tourists photograph and mistake for absence. He had, in I think, the 4 minutes of Prentice's reading, the posture and the effect of architecture. When Prentice finished and looked up expectantly, Reeve's eyes came forward from the middle distance. They found Prentice. They stayed there a count of 3, which I timed, and then they moved back. Prentice waited. For the record, he said, with the specific intonation of a man assembling a transcript in real time, are you refusing to engage? No, sir, Reeve said. 1 beat. If you've correspondence for the Lord Chamberlain's office, the address is available on the official Royal Household website. Letters received through proper channels are processed within standard administrative timeframes. Prentice opened his mouth. I'm not in a position, Reeve said, the same quiet structural beam voice I'd heard on Tuesday, to receive correspondence at this post. That's, I think, not what this post is for. It landed. Even Prentice, who had spent a career turning language into tap into, stood for a moment with his mouth slightly open in the specific way of a man whose mechanism has encountered a surface it wasn't designed for. He left, and I sat back from the glass and looked at my notebook. 7 pages, now, across 3 encounters. Plus, 3 guards Reeve again, 3 different approaches from Hale's side of the equation, escalating in sophistication each time, and 3 outcomes that were, stripped to their core, identical. The gate, I think, had not opened. Not once. Not an inch, which I thought about this for a long time, there in the corridor with my cold coffee and my pen, and I noticed something that hadn't fully assembled itself for me across the previous entries. Hale had, in 3 attempts, deployed wealth, documentation, a professional fixer, an administrative reference, a legal threat, a public performance of grievance, and the weight of his own name. Each instrument was more sophisticated than the last. Each had been neutralized not by force, not by escalation, but by, and I was careful with the word I chose here, writing it and then going back and writing it again to make sure I meant it, completeness. The guards were complete. That's the only word that worked. They didn't need anything from Hale, not his approval, not his money, not the validation of recognizing his importance. They weren't resisting him. Resistance implies a force being opposed. They simply occupied their function so entirely that there was no gap for him to enter through. Hale had spent his career identifying gaps. Every acquisition, every committee, every customs officer at 2 a.m. a gap. A space between what a thing was supposed to be and what it actually was, in the moment, with the right application of pressure. These men had no gap. The thought sat in me in a way NT expected. I went home that evening and I told my wife about it, not the specifics, I'm careful with those. The shape of the thing, and she listened the way she listens, with her head slightly tilted, and then, she said, what did he actually want though? What was through the gate? I didn't know. TBH, I still don't. It's possible Hale himself had reached the point where the gate was no longer the point. The gate had become a referendum on whether the world worked the way he'd always understood it to work. The answer, delivered TBH, 3 times in 3 different keys, was no. A week later, I heard through Belhost, who heard it through someone who wouldn't specify their source, that the Hale Cultural Foundation had quietly withdrawn a substantial proposed donation to a heritage organization with royal household adjacency. Belhost mentioned it without looking up from his desk. I wrote it in the notebook. Underneath I wrote, he couldn't buy the gate. So he stopped paying for things near the gate. I thought about Reeves' thumb moving along his glove seam. I thought about Osei's 2-letter thermonuclear device. I thought about what it means to be so fully a thing that no amount of money can find the seam of you. Then, Belhost looked up and asked me why I was smiling. I told him I wasn't. He looked at me for a long moment. Reeves been asked to brief the next intake, he said. Tuesday fortnight. About gate conduct. He went back to his papers. What do you think he'll say? I asked. Belhost didn't answer. But the corner of his mouth moved.